In the years before the Second World War, the United States appeared to many observers as a giant reluctant to move. The scars of the Great War still lingered in American memory. In the 1920s and 30s, isolationist sentiment ran deep. Congress passed laws to prevent involvement in foreign conflicts, and large parts of the public believed that Europe's endless quarrels should remain Europe's problem. The Great Depression had left millions unemployed, farms foreclosed, factories shuttered, and the priority of most citizens was rebuilding their own lives, not sending troops across oceans. The cry of "America First" was not merely a slogan, but a widely held conviction that involvement abroad had only brought misery and betrayal once before. Meanwhile, the world beyond America's shores was moving toward disaster. In Asia, Imperial Japan embarked on campaigns of conquest, occupying Manchuria in the early 1930s and later waging war against China. In Europe, Adolf Hitler rebuilt German power with startling speed, rearming openly and sending troops into the Rhineland, then annexing Austria and carving up Czechoslovakia. Benito Mussolini's Italy attacked Ethiopia and joined Germany in creating an axis of authoritarian ambition. One by one, treaties collapsed, international institutions faltered, and aggression went unanswered. Roosevelt, who assumed the presidency in 1933, watched these events with alarm. He believed that fascist aggression threatened the stability of the entire world. Yet he also knew that most Americans remained hostile to entanglements overseas. Roosevelt sought to balance these currents. He spoke publicly of peace and neutrality, but quietly worked to prepare the nation for the possibility of war. Military budgets increased, industry was encouraged to modernize, and diplomatic ties with Britain grew stronger. The Lend-Lease program, announced in 1941 before the United States formally entered the conflict, provided supplies to nations resisting Germany, especially Britain. Roosevelt compared the program to lending a neighbor a garden hose to extinguish a fire that threatened the whole neighborhood. He argued that helping Britain defend itself was essential to America's own security. Still, opposition remained fierce. Isolationist voices in Congress accused the president of dragging the country toward another European war. The Soviet Union was viewed in even more ambivalent terms. To many Americans, it represented a system utterly alien to their values, marked by dictatorship, purges, and the suppression of religion. Conservative newspapers portrayed Joseph Stalin as scarcely less menacing than Hitler. Yet some intellectuals and workers admired the Soviet experiment, seeing in it a bold attempt to overcome the Depression through planning and collective effort. The truth was often obscured by ideology. Few in the United States had a clear picture of the terror that accompanied Stalin's rule. The Soviet Union remained distant, mysterious, and distrusted, though not irrelevant. As the 1930s closed, tension mounted. Hitler's invasion of Poland in September of 1939 finally unleashed the general European war that many had feared. Britain and France declared war, but the United States remained neutral. Roosevelt increased aid to Britain and France, but reassured the public that no American boys would be sent to fight. Then came the shocking news that the Soviet Union, having signed a non-aggression pact with Germany, also invaded Poland from the east. To many Americans, this seemed proof that communism and fascism were two sides of the same coin, both prepared to carve up weaker nations. Isolationist voices grew louder, arguing that Europe was a sink of treachery and violence best avoided. The picture shifted again when Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941. Suddenly, Stalin, once depicted as a tyrant allied with Hitler, became the enemy of America's enemy. Roosevelt seized on the opportunity. He extended Lend-Lease aid to the Soviet Union despite protests that American resources should not go to communists. The calculation was straightforward. If the Soviet Union fell, Hitler would dominate the continent. If it held, German forces would be tied down, buying time for Britain and perhaps America itself. Even with this aid, Roosevelt trod carefully. He knew that many Americans distrusted Stalin and would resent supporting him. Thus, he framed assistance in pragmatic rather than ideological terms. He did not praise communism, but instead emphasized the necessity of defeating Hitler. Behind the scenes, American diplomats in Moscow reported on Soviet desperation. Soviet officials demanded tanks, planes, trucks, and food in staggering quantities. The United States began shipping convoys across the Arctic seas to Murmansk, enduring horrific conditions and attacks from German aircraft and submarines. The supplies that reached the Soviet front lines, jeeps, radios, canned meat, locomotives, became lifelines for Red Army soldiers. Yet despite these steps, the United States itself still remained outside the war until December of 1941. It was not the fall of France, nor the bombing of Britain, nor the invasion of the Soviet Union that pushed America in, but the attack on Pearl Harbor. On a quiet Sunday morning, Japanese aircraft struck the American fleet in Hawaii, sinking battleships, killing thousands, and stunning the nation. Overnight, the isolationist sentiment that had dominated American politics collapsed. Congress declared war on Japan with only a single dissenting vote, and within days, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. The nation was now fully engaged in a global conflict. The question of why America entered the war was therefore shaped by multiple layers. On the surface, it was Pearl Harbor, a sudden act of aggression that galvanized public opinion. Beneath that surface, however, lay Roosevelt's long-held conviction that fascist powers threatened American interests and world stability. The United States could not remain a fortress surrounded by oceans while dictators seized continents. Roosevelt had maneuvered carefully, building support, preparing industry, and forging ties with Britain, and eventually, the Soviet Union. Pearl Harbor merely made explicit what had already become inevitable. Relations with the Soviet Union in these early days of alliance were tense, but essential. Roosevelt extended his hand to Stalin, writing letters that emphasized partnership. Stalin, though suspicious, welcomed the aid. The Red Army faced catastrophe in the winter of 1941, and every shipment of food and weapons mattered. Ideological hostility was temporarily set aside. For Roosevelt, cooperation with Stalin was a bitter pill for many of his compatriots, but he believed it was necessary. For Stalin, cooperation with Roosevelt was equally fraught, but survival required it. Thus, a bond of necessity began to form, fragile, pragmatic, and destined to shape the future of the war. By the end of 1941, the world had been transformed. The United States was now at war in both Europe and the Pacific. The Soviet Union remained locked in a life-and-death struggle against Hitler. Britain held on despite years of bombardment. The great powers that had once eyed one another with suspicion now stood together, united less by friendship than by the reality of common enemies. For Roosevelt and Stalin, the relationship was born not of trust but of need. And yet in that need lay the foundation of an alliance that would determine the course of the 20th century. The entry of the United States into the Second World War after the attack on Pearl Harbor transformed the conflict into a truly global struggle. What had begun as a European war and an Asian war now became a confrontation in which the world's greatest industrial power was fully committed. The American people, shocked and enraged by the devastation in Hawaii, moved almost overnight from isolationism to mobilization. Factories that had been recovering slowly from the Great Depression roared into action, producing tanks, planes, ships, and rifles in staggering quantities. Young men lined up at recruitment offices, and millions of women stepped into the workforce to replace them. The United States became, as Roosevelt had promised, the arsenal of democracy. At the same time, the question of alliance loomed large. Britain welcomed American entry with relief, for Winston Churchill knew that without American manpower and industry, the war might still be lost. Stalin, too, recognized the significance immediately. The Soviet Union had been carrying the weight of the land war against Hitler almost alone since June of 1941, and now the promise of a fully engaged America offered hope that relief might come. Yet Stalin's relief was mixed with suspicion. He feared that Roosevelt and Churchill might seek a separate peace with Germany, or might delay in opening a true second front in Western Europe, leaving the Red Army to face the bulk of German power indefinitely. The early campaigns revealed both cooperation and tension. American forces, inexperienced and untested, fought first in North Africa alongside the British. The landings in late 1942 and the subsequent battles against German and Italian troops marked the beginning of America's ground war. For Stalin, however, these operations seemed a poor substitute for the massive invasion of France that he demanded. Each month that passed without such an invasion deepened his suspicion that his allies were content to let the Soviet Union bleed. Roosevelt, who understood the necessity of Soviet endurance, wrote repeatedly to Stalin to reassure him of America's commitment. He explained the logistical difficulties, the need to build up forces, the necessity of first securing the Mediterranean. But Stalin was not convinced. Meanwhile, the Lend-Lease program expanded dramatically. Convoys crossed the Atlantic and the Arctic, delivering trucks, jeeps, locomotives, aircraft, food, and clothing. The harsh voyage to Murmansk was among the most dangerous of the war, plagued by storms, ice, and constant German attacks. Hundreds of ships were lost, and thousands of sailors died. Yet the supplies that reached the Soviet Union made a crucial difference. American trucks carried Soviet artillery. American aircraft patrolled Soviet skies. Cans of American meat and powdered milk sustained Soviet soldiers. For Roosevelt, this aid was proof that the alliance was real. For Stalin, it was welcome, but never enough. He always asked for more, measuring promises against deliveries with ruthless precision. Diplomatic contacts deepened as well. American and Soviet officials met to coordinate strategy, exchange intelligence, and negotiate terms. Yet cultural and ideological differences remained stark. American officers were astonished by the secrecy of their Soviet counterparts, who revealed little and demanded much. Soviet officials, in turn, saw Americans as naive or duplicitous, offering words of friendship while withholding decisive action. Every meeting was a dance of calculation, each side probing the other for weakness. Despite the tension, the alliance produced results. The defeat of German forces at Stalingrad in the winter of 1942 to 1943 electrified the world. The Red Army had halted and then reversed the tide of invasion, proving that Hitler's armies were not invincible. Roosevelt seized upon the victory as evidence that cooperation with Stalin was essential. American newspapers that once demonized the Soviet leader now printed cartoons portraying him as a stalwart partner against tyranny. Public opinion, though still wary of communism, grew more supportive of the alliance. Roosevelt encouraged this shift, speaking of Stalin with a degree of respect that surprised many of his listeners. Still, Roosevelt faced the delicate task of balancing support for the Soviet Union with the concerns of his other ally, Britain. Churchill distrusted Stalin deeply and often clashed with Roosevelt over how far to go in accommodating him. Roosevelt sometimes leaned toward Stalin, hoping to build trust, while Churchill warned that such trust would be betrayed. This triangular dynamic shaped much of the wartime diplomacy. Roosevelt believed he could manage Stalin with respect and promises, while Churchill insisted that only firmness would restrain him. Stalin, observing these differences, exploited them skillfully. American soldiers, too, began to encounter the reality of alliance. In Tehran, Cairo, and later in Moscow, delegations of generals and planners worked side by side with Soviet counterparts. Reports flowed back to Washington of the immense sacrifices on the Eastern Front, of cities reduced to rubble, of millions of dead. For many Americans, these stories fostered admiration for Soviet resilience, but they also underscored the vast gulf in political culture. American troops fought to defend democracy, however imperfect. Soviet troops fought under the command of a leader who ruled through fear and purges. Yet in the crucible of war, these differences were set aside. The immediate goal of crushing Hitler overshadowed everything else. The American home front mirrored these complexities. Propaganda films portrayed the Soviet Union as a brave ally, showing images of Soviet soldiers in snow-covered trenches holding the line against fascism. Magazines ran stories of Soviet industry relocated east of the Urals, producing weapons despite enormous hardships. Yet at the same time, suspicions lingered. Some Americans worried about what would happen after the war, whether the Soviet Union would dominate Eastern Europe. Roosevelt, while aware of these concerns, believed it was essential to focus on the present. The future could be negotiated later. For now, he told his advisors, the Soviets must be supported at any cost. By 1943, the alliance had matured into what was often called the Grand Alliance. The Big Three, Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill, stood together as the leaders of the anti-fascist coalition. But beneath the triumphant photographs and the carefully worded communiqué, mistrust remained. Roosevelt still dreamed of a post-war world governed by collective security, anchored by a United Nations where the great powers would work together. Stalin dreamed of a sphere of influence that would guarantee Soviet security. Both men knew that their visions were not the same, but neither could admit it openly while the war still raged. Thus, the first years of America's participation in the war were marked by contradictions. At home, the nation mobilized with unprecedented speed, uniting behind Roosevelt's leadership. Abroad, it forged an alliance with a regime that many Americans despised. On the battlefield, it contributed to victories that began to turn the tide. And in the halls of diplomacy, it laid the groundwork for a post-war order that would prove both hopeful and fragile. The relationship with the Soviet Union was essential, productive, and profoundly uneasy. It was born of necessity, nurtured by promises, and shadowed by suspicion. As American troops prepared for the great invasion of Western Europe, Roosevelt looked ahead with guarded optimism. He believed that the partnership with Stalin, difficult as it was, could endure beyond the war. He imagined a new world where differences could be managed within institutions, where mistrust could be contained by rules, and where the mistakes of the past would not be repeated. Whether Stalin shared this vision remained doubtful, but in those years of hard-won victories, the illusion of unity still held. The cracks that would later widen into the Cold War were already there, but for the moment, they were hidden beneath the banners of victory. By the middle of the war, the alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union had reached its most visible height. The immense clash at Stalingrad, ending in early 1943, had demonstrated the capacity of the Red Army to not only resist, but to defeat the Wehrmacht. For Roosevelt and his advisors, the Soviet victory was a turning point that justified the enormous investment of resources in Lend-Lease aid. It also signaled that the Soviet Union would remain a central player in the struggle until the very end. No longer was there fear of a collapse in the East. Instead, there was recognition that Stalin's armies would march deep into Europe and would help determine the shape of the continent. The flow of American supplies into the Soviet Union reached staggering levels. Hundreds of thousands of trucks, tens of thousands of aircraft, vast quantities of food, fuel, boots, and radios poured across oceans and through treacherous routes. Some went by the icy Arctic convoys, others through Iran, along what became known as the Persian corridor, and still others via the Pacific under special arrangements. These supplies did not replace Soviet industry, which had been relocated east of the Urals and was producing weapons in immense factories, but they did provide mobility and sustenance. American jeeps carried Soviet commanders, American locomotives pulled Soviet trains, and American canned goods filled Soviet ration packs. Soldiers at the front learned to appreciate the strange taste of Spam, a product of distant Midwestern factories. At the same time, American commanders gained growing respect for Soviet endurance. Reports from the Eastern Front described battles of unimaginable scale. The confrontation at Kursk in the summer of 1943 was the largest tank battle in history, involving thousands of armored vehicles and millions of men. When the Red Army emerged victorious, pushing the Germans westward, the world saw that the tide had definitively turned. Roosevelt praised Soviet achievements publicly, speaking of them as heroic contributions to the common cause. Privately, he believed that Stalin must be kept engaged not only through praise, but through concrete commitments. That commitment was most urgently expressed in the demand for a second front in Western Europe. Stalin had been asking for it since 1942, growing impatient with the campaigns in North Africa and the Mediterranean. At the Tehran Conference in November of 1943, Roosevelt and Churchill finally gave Stalin the assurance he sought. They promised the launch of Operation Overlord, the invasion of France, in the summer of 1944. Stalin, though naturally suspicious, accepted the pledge. He knew that without such a front, his own armies would bear the brunt of the war indefinitely. For Roosevelt, the promise was a way to maintain trust, to keep the alliance intact, and to demonstrate that America would not abandon the Soviet struggle. The Tehran Conference marked the first time Roosevelt and Stalin met in person. The American president, despite his frail health, traveled to the Iranian capital to sit at the same table as the Soviet leader. Their conversations revealed both the possibility and the difficulty of cooperation. Roosevelt sought to cultivate Stalin personally, addressing him directly, joking at times, and showing deference to his military concerns. Stalin, accustomed to suspicion, responded with guarded cordiality. He appreciated Roosevelt's willingness to treat him as an equal rather than to lecture him. Churchill, by contrast, often clashed with Stalin, and Roosevelt sometimes sided with the Soviet leader to keep the balance. The dynamic among the three men, later immortalized as the Big Three, reflected not only the unity of purpose, but also the undercurrents of rivalry that would shape the future. The discussions in Tehran went beyond military plans. They touched on the outlines of a post-war world. Roosevelt outlined his vision of a new international organization, a United Nations that would prevent future wars by uniting great powers in collective security. Stalin listened carefully, offering cautious approval while calculating how such a body might serve Soviet interests. He wanted recognition of his sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, assurances of security on his western borders, and reparations from Germany. Roosevelt believed that by binding Stalin into the structure of the United Nations, these ambitions could be managed peacefully. Stalin believed that recognition of Soviet power was already an accomplished fact, guaranteed by the advance of his armies. When the Western Allies finally landed in Normandy in June of 1944, Stalin regarded it as the long-awaited proof of American seriousness. The Soviet Union was still engaged in brutal battles on its own front, but now the pressure was shared. Roosevelt hoped that this would ease Soviet suspicions. Yet the reality was that by the time the Allies crossed the Channel, the Red Army had already liberated much of its own territory and was pushing into Poland. The timing fed Stalin's sense that the West had delayed intentionally, but the sheer scale of the invasion convinced him that at last his allies were fully engaged. The partnership reached its symbolic zenith at the Yalta Conference in February of 1945. By then, the war in Europe was clearly approaching its end. Soviet armies were on the Oder River, a short distance from Berlin. American and British troops had crossed the Rhine and were advancing into the German heartland. The question was no longer whether Hitler would be defeated, but what would come after. Roosevelt, gravely ill yet determined, traveled to the Crimean resort town to meet Stalin once again. The photographs from Yalta, showing the three leaders sitting together, became iconic images of wartime unity. Yet behind the smiles and handshakes lay the deep questions of the post-war settlement. Roosevelt pressed Stalin to agree to free elections in Poland and other liberated nations. Stalin gave assurances, but his understanding of free was different from Roosevelt's. To him, security required friendly governments, which in practice meant communist governments under Soviet control. At Yalta, they also finalized the plans for the United Nations. Roosevelt secured Stalin's agreement to join the new body and to accept a system in which the great powers held permanent seats on the Security Council. It was a compromise between idealism and realism, recognizing that peace could not be enforced without the cooperation of those who held the most power. Roosevelt hoped that this institution would be his legacy, a way to prevent the collapse into chaos that had followed the First World War. Stalin accepted, knowing that membership gave him recognition as a global equal. They also divided Germany into zones of occupation, laying the groundwork for what would eventually become two states. They agreed on the need for reparations, though the amounts and methods remained disputed. They planned for Soviet entry into the war against Japan after Germany's defeat, an assurance Roosevelt valued deeply as American forces prepared for a costly invasion of the Japanese home islands. Each of these agreements carried within it the seeds of future conflict, but at the time they were presented as triumphs of unity. Roosevelt left Yalta convinced that cooperation with Stalin was possible, if fragile. He believed that the personal bond he had cultivated could outlast the war and serve as the foundation for peace. Stalin left Yalta satisfied that his strategic interests were secured. He admired Roosevelt's pragmatism, but never abandoned suspicion. Each man saw in the other a necessary partner, but not a friend. For a brief moment in those months of 1944 and early 1945, the alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union seemed to embody both victory and hope. On the battlefields, their soldiers fought separately, but toward the same end. In the halls of diplomacy, their leaders sat together and mapped the future. Yet beneath the surface, the contradictions were plain. The visions of Roosevelt and Stalin could not be reconciled indefinitely. The unity of the Grand Alliance was real, but it was temporary, born of necessity rather than trust. In the spring of 1945, as Allied armies converged on Berlin, the bond of cooperation still held. But already it was fraying, weakened by ideological differences, territorial ambitions, and mutual suspicion. The partnership had reached its peak, and from that peak, it would begin its decline. The shadow of victory already contained the outlines of a new conflict, one that would outlast both Roosevelt and Stalin, and would define the world for decades to come. When the guns of Europe fell silent in the spring of 1945, the alliance that had carried the United States and the Soviet Union to victory stood at a moment of triumph and fragility. Together with Britain, they had destroyed Nazi Germany, liberated capitals, and reshaped the political landscape of the continent. Yet almost immediately, the lines of unity began to fray. What had been held together by the necessity of defeating Hitler was now confronted with the reality of how to shape the peace. In that reality, the profound differences between Franklin Roosevelt's America and Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union could no longer be disguised. The first blow came with Roosevelt's sudden death in April of 1945. For years, he had been the architect of American diplomacy, the man who believed that personal relationships could soften suspicion and that international institutions could contain rivalry. He had written to Stalin dozens of times, using a language of respect that no other Western leader would have chosen. Even when frustrated, he maintained a belief that Stalin could be a partner in peace if treated as an equal. His death removed that bridge. In his place stood Harry Truman, a man who had not shared the intimate exchanges with Stalin and who possessed none of Roosevelt's patience. Truman's instinct was blunt, his words firm, his willingness to compromise far smaller. Stalin recognized instantly that the American tone had changed. The shift was apparent at the Potsdam Conference in July of that same year. Stalin arrived confident, his armies occupying vast territories across Eastern Europe, his influence already entrenched. Truman arrived with a new weapon in his arsenal, the atomic bomb, successfully tested only days before. Though he mentioned it to Stalin in passing, the Soviet leader already knew of its existence through his intelligence network. He listened without visible reaction, but he returned to Moscow determined to accelerate the Soviet atomic program. Thus, even before Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the seeds of an arms race were planted. The disputes at Potsdam revolved around familiar issues: Germany's future, reparations, Poland, and the shape of post-war Europe. Stalin insisted on massive reparations from Germany to compensate for the catastrophic destruction his nation had endured. Truman and Churchill, and later Attlee, feared that too harsh a settlement would repeat the mistakes of the previous war. Stalin refused to loosen his grip on Poland, where a communist-dominated government was already consolidating power. Truman demanded free elections, pointing to promises made at Yalta. Stalin gave assurances that sounded cooperative, but in practice meant little. For him, Poland was not negotiable. It was the shield that had to remain firmly in Soviet hands. As weeks passed, the optimism that Roosevelt had carried into Yalta evaporated. American officials reported that communist parties across Eastern Europe, backed by Soviet armies and security forces, were seizing ministries, controlling police, and eliminating rivals. In Romania and Bulgaria, monarchies collapsed under Soviet pressure. In Hungary, opponents were silenced. In Czechoslovakia, the democratic tradition still lingered, but was already being strangled. To Washington, it looked as though Stalin was not honoring agreements, but exploiting them, using wartime promises as cover for a post-war takeover. To Moscow, it looked as though the West was plotting to encircle and undermine the Soviet sphere, using rhetoric of democracy as a weapon. Each side believed the other deceitful, and each prepared for confrontation. The atomic bomb, dropped on Hiroshima in August of 1945, symbolized both the end of the war and the dawn of a new rivalry. Truman believed that demonstrating such power would strengthen American bargaining positions. Stalin saw it as a direct threat. a signal that the United States intended to dominate the post-war order by force of technology. His reaction was not panic, but determination. The Soviet atomic project, already underway, now became a national priority. Within 4 years, Moscow would have its own bomb, and the world would be locked into a nuclear standoff. For ordinary Americans, the wartime image of the Soviet Union as a heroic ally began to fade quickly. Newspapers that once praised the Red Army now warned of Soviet expansion. For many in Europe, the change was even more immediate. Refugees, political exiles, and ordinary citizens in eastern capitals realized that liberation had given way to occupation. Flags of freedom were replaced by portraits of Stalin. Secret police knocked on doors. Trials silenced opposition. The phrase "Iron Curtain," used by Winston Churchill in a speech in 1946, captured the reality that half the continent was no longer accessible to the West. Truman responded with what became known as the Truman Doctrine, a pledge to support free peoples resisting subjugation. Aid to Greece and Turkey, later expanded into the Marshall Plan for European Reconstruction, sought to contain Soviet influence by rebuilding economies and strengthening democracies. Stalin denounced these moves as imperialism under a new guise. He countered by tightening control through the Cominform and later through the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. What had been a coalition of necessity during the war was now openly a contest of systems, each claiming to embody the future of mankind. The bitterness was all the more striking because only months earlier, American and Soviet soldiers had embraced on the Elbe River, celebrating victory together. Photographs of those meetings, with soldiers exchanging badges and cigarettes, seemed at the time to promise enduring friendship. Within a year, those same images looked like relics of a fleeting illusion. The smiles of the Elbe gave way to the grim reality of suspicion and rivalry. In retrospect, the wartime alliance had always contained the seeds of its own destruction. Roosevelt believed that by engaging Stalin personally, he could build trust and restrain ambition. Stalin believed that by accepting Roosevelt's words, he could buy time and gain resources while pursuing Soviet goals. Each saw the alliance as necessary but temporary. The victory over Germany removed the necessity. What remained were clashing visions of Europe and incompatible notions of security. For Stalin, the war had confirmed his deepest convictions, that only strength, control, and domination could protect his nation from another invasion. For Truman, the war had reinforced the opposite lesson, that only openness, cooperation, and free institutions could prevent tyranny. These lessons were irreconcilable. Thus, the alliance that had defeated Hitler did not survive peace. The United States and the Soviet Union, once comrades in arms, became adversaries in a new kind of conflict. The Cold War was not declared with formal speeches or treaties, but emerged in the months after victory, in every argument about borders, in every dispute about reparations, in every veto cast at the United Nations. The relationship that Roosevelt had nurtured with cautious optimism collapsed into suspicion. The fragile friendship dissolved, replaced by enmity that would dominate the second half of the 20th century. The story of America's entry into the Second World War and its relations with the Soviet Union is therefore a story of paradox. The United States joined the conflict because it was attacked. Yet long before that attack, Roosevelt had recognized the danger of fascist aggression. The United States allied with a communist dictatorship because survival demanded it. Yet from the beginning, suspicion persisted. Together, America and the Soviet Union achieved victory, yet that very victory exposed the incompatibility of their aims. By the late 1940s, the image of Roosevelt and Stalin as partners in shaping peace was replaced by the reality of Truman and Stalin as adversaries shaping confrontation. The journey from alliance to rivalry was swift, perhaps inevitable, and it defined the modern world. Out of the ashes of victory rose not unity, but division, a division that would cast its shadow across decades, across continents, and across generations. Subscribe us. We don't say goodbye.